Ruth, I want to thank you personally for that stirring address. You've been such a great friend to me, to Tikva, our teacher in so many ways for so many years. It's a great honor to confer upon you the Herzl Prize, and if nothing else, to give you yet another occasion for a serious reflection on Jewish life, culture, civilization, and politics. Ruth, we thank you. Our next session is with Ambassador David Friedman, one of the architects of the historic Abraham Accords. And to think seriously about something historic, we thought it right to get a serious historian to sit down with Ambassador Friedman. And we have just the man for the job in Dr. Martin Kramer. Dr. Kramer is the founding president of Shalem College. He is the Walter Stern Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near Eastern Policy. He's a prolific author and editor of books, essays, articles, blog posts, and op-eds. And he is, for me, one of the most cherished contributors of our own Mosaic magazine, where his analysis of Middle Eastern history, of modern Israel, of Zionism, of so many important subjects is second to none. Dr. Kramer will be sitting down with Ambassador Friedman at our offices in Jerusalem. Martin, I turn this over to you.
Thank you very much, Eric. Ambassador Friedman, delighted to have you for this interview in the framework of the Jewish Leadership Conference. It's a great honor for us, and I think a privilege for our audience to have you. You are now former ambassador of the United States to Israel, a lawyer by profession, political appointee to the office, and in 4 years of service, you had 4 landmarks. The U.S. recognition of Jerusalem as capital of Israel, moving the embassy to Jerusalem, the U.S. recognition of Israeli sovereignty in the Golan Heights, the launching of an ambitious peace plan, and the transformative Abraham Accords. And for that last achievement, you've been, as I understand, nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize, along with Ron Dermer and Avi Berkowitz and Jared Kushner. I don't know whether you're going to get it, but people have gotten it for less.
Maybe I would. I would be. I would not be betting on it, but thank you for having me, and it's a great honor to be with you and to have a conversation with you. And thank you for all you've done as well.
Yes. Well, I have to congratulate you on your service. If we were in front of a live audience, you'd probably get a standing ovation at this point. So that's going to have to suffice.
That's fine. Thank you.
I'm sure you're decompressing, as all former ambassadors do. I'm grateful that we have this opportunity to cover some ground. Since I'm an historian and not a journalist, I'd like us to do 2 things here. The first is to get your take on how the Abraham Accords came to be. We both know that no 2 people will tell the same story in the same way, and you'll probably have a memoir in which you'll tell the full version. But I think our audience now would have 1 or 2 questions about what happened, and I'm going to ask them. And second, we'll do some speculation a bit about the future.
Sure.
Let me begin, before we go there, though, with this question. By profession, you aren't a diplomat or a policy expert. I take it you think that's an advantage. So why don't you tell me why?
You're, I think, the first person who's ever called me a diplomat. I appreciate that. Thank you.
I said you're not.
Oh, I'm not a diplomat.
I said you're not a diplomat.
So then
you're not a policy expert.
Okay, so the record is the record is clear.
So why do you think that's an advantage?
I think there are few, and I don't mean any disrespect to diplomats, because many of them have done outstanding work over the years. But especially, I think, in the Middle East, it was due for some unconventional thinking. Most of the policy in the Middle East, whether it was a Republican or Democratic administration, was driven off of a lot of conventional wisdom that I think proved to be not particularly valid. And I think in the Middle East in particular, value is placed on direct communication, on being strong, even at the expense of being blunt, and on being able to communicate, I think, very directly what the United States wants or expects or is willing to do. So, the first thing I decided when I took this post was simply not to meet Einstein's definition of insanity, right? Not to do the same thing and expect a different result. And look, not being burdened with many years of having studied or worked for other diplomats, or not being allegiant to any particular point of view, I think gave us an open field to kind of chart our own course, which we're very proud of. So I think the primary advantage is not being wed to the past. The second is, as somebody who had basically a commercial career, a business career, a problem-solving career, we looked at things, like we did in our past lives, whether it was Jared or me. What do we want to accomplish? What are the things standing in our way? As to those obstacles, how do we resolve it? What do people want? What do they need? What can we live with? What's reasonable? What's not? It's the way people have transacted business for years, and we did bring a lot of that to our approach.
Was there one piece of conventional wisdom which particularly struck you as needing deflation?
Well, the most among a lot of things that we thought were wrong, the most wrong was what I would say sort of the indulgence of the Palestinian cause to the point where it negated the notion of accountability. So there would be this equivalence created between, for example, building settlements and committing acts of terrorism. Now, you could be pro-settlement or you could be against settlements, but you cannot possibly equate that with cold-blooded murder of innocent civilians. So, or I should say, cold-blooded murder of soldiers as well. I mean, you could not equate those two. So, we thought that the way the U.S. and most of the world, the way they were looking about the Palestinians, number one, they were giving them a pass on egregious human rights violations. They were giving them a pass on the inability of Hamas and the PA to ever coalesce on anything. They were given a pass on terrorism, giving a pass on pay for slay, which was abhorrent to us. They were given a pass on not creating any of the institutions that were necessary for autonomy, whether it would be financial transparency, anti-corruption measures, a system of justice where that was predictable. So a series of commercial laws that would enable people to invest. None of these things were there, and yet people were talking about a Palestinian state. So to me, you had this completely cart before the horse, and where it was leading was to a place that I thought was the absolute worst place to be, which is to create a dysfunctional terror state right between Israel and Jordan. That was the path that I thought we inherited. Now, that is such a bad outcome that, we needed to really reverse that and reverse it quickly. It wasn't something where, you're steering an aircraft carrier and you have the benefit of, thinking, miles ahead. We had to change that rapidly. And that was what I thought was the primary mistake within the, again, not to blame Democrats. It was true of Republicans as well.
Let's get more into the record. And I want to set aside for now Jerusalem and the Golan, only because time is short.
Sure.
They were important, perhaps historic. I don't know if they were as transformative as two initiatives that you were deeply involved in, which promised to be transformative. One was the Vision for Peace between Israel and the Palestinians, and the other, the Abraham Accords. Now, I want to start with the first. A little over a year ago, when the vision was launched, Prime Minister Netanyahu said the following. I'm going to quote him. Mr. President, I believe that down the decades and perhaps down the centuries, we will also remember January 28, 2020, because on this day, you became the first world leader to recognize Israel's sovereignty over areas in Judea and Samaria that are vital to our security and central to our heritage, end of quote. But on January 28, 2021, the one-year anniversary, it really went unnoticed. I don't know what the centuries will say. I don't know what the decades will say. But at present, it looks like one more plan added to sort of the ever-growing pile. Now, Jared Kushner admitted at one point, he said that it was smart money bet was against the success of the plan. He said, if we're going to fail, I remember the quote, if we're going to fail, we don't want to fail in the same way that others have failed before. That gets back to the conventional wisdom. Mm-hmm. But I'm asking, maybe it is the same failure. All these plans look the same. The Great Father, British Royal Commission, 1937, UN in 1947, Bill Clinton with his parameters. You propose a plan to divide the land. The Jews accept it with reservations. The Arabs totally reject it. It gets left on the shelf, and only historians remember it. So why is that, if you think it's the wrong way to look at it, why is that the wrong way to look at it?
I just think it's too soon to know how to look at it.
Yeah.
It's been, a year is not a long time in this conflict. Look, I think I'm certainly not ready to accept failure. I think that the reactions that we got back in January of 2020 were quite astounding if you think about it. I mean, remember the reflexive position of the Arab world with regard to the Palestinians up until that point. Now, the first thing that happened was the European Union tried to condemn our plan, and 6 countries, blocked that resolution, including Italy, Czech Republic, Austria. I don't have it committed to memory, but 6 different countries within the EU. And then Abu Mazen went to the UN Security Council. And what was his bet there? That he was going to get a 14-1 vote condemning the plan and isolate the United States as the only veto. What happened? The Tunisian who sponsored the plan, right? He got fired the next day. He was recalled as soon as he put up a resolution condemning the plan, and they couldn't even muster a majority. He withdrew it. So this had real, I wouldn't call it buy-in, but certainly a high level of respect and tolerance from a lot of countries that just generally don't side with Israel. So that's where I think this is more than just than focusing on Palestinian rejection. The principles are also significant. Look, there was nothing principled about the partition plan, right? That was just a real estate carve up. I think the map that's attached to our plan, while it's significant and meaningful and unprecedented in the history of Israel, it's one of the least important aspects of our plan. The important aspects of our plan are: how do we deal with Israel's security? How do we protect Israel from the possibility of a terrorist Palestinian state? What does Palestinian autonomy really mean? What does the United States expect from the Palestinians before it will put its stamp of approval on a Palestinian state? And I think the concept that the United States and hopefully the world will never put its imprimatur on a failed terrorist state is a very important concept. No one ever put that out before. It goes back to my point about accountability. So the principles are significant. And the other thing, which is that because the reaction from the world was so muted, in some respects, I think the most important response was from Saudi Arabia, right? They came out and said, we appreciate the effort. We think that negotiations should continue under the auspices of the United States, not under the auspices of the Quartet, not by the United Nations, but the United States. So here you have the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, the leader of the Muslim world, saying that this plan is a good start. Now, were the Palestinians receptive? No, but the Palestinian leadership, I think, would have been receptive to absolutely nothing. There was no piece of paper that we could have written that it would have been something that the Palestinians were receptive to. So what do we have? You put it all together. What do we end up with? A plan that the majority of Israelis support, most Israeli politicians support, many at least in the Republican Party in the United States support, and many nations, Europe, the Gulf, the Middle East, Kingdom of Morocco, think has a lot of promise. So that's why I'm saying, okay, we're a year into it. We don't have a deal, but we've sure gone a lot further than most other plans. And again, in contrast to everything else, this is actually a plan that protects Israel's security, and many Israelis will support. So I'm not giving up yet.
Well, I think you're absolutely right in that the plan does have an element that you don't find in the previous partition plans, which is that there's a bar that's set for the Palestinians. They have to cross it in order to cement their right to exercise self-determination. But I want to ask a follow-on question based on a quote that you gave about endgame here. And you'll tell me if the quote is accurate, and if it is, I'd like you to sort of elaborate on the point.
Sure.
And it goes like this, and this is you speaking. Here are the facts that never go away. First is that nobody wants to establish sovereignty over the entirety of Judea and Samaria and provide citizenship to the millions of Palestinians who are there. Second, there is no way in the modern world that a country, especially a country as great as Israel, could possibly be a country with two classes of citizens where one votes and the other doesn't. It can't be done. End of quote. So that doesn't sound like a complete deviation from traditional U.S. policy.
No, I think that that sounds like something I would say, and I think it basically is a long-winded way of saying, as between a one-state solution and a two-state solution, a two-state solution is really the only means of resolving the conflict as between those two choices. It doesn't mean that the status quo can't go on for some period of time, but as between those two choices, I certainly agree that a two-state solution is the only practical means. Now, what we did, which is different. Now, in that way, we don't depart from our predecessors, but the way we do depart is by creating, number one, a means for Israel to protect itself under any scenario. You look at the Middle East, 20 years ago or 10 years ago, nobody expected the Arab Spring, no one expected the Syrian civil war, no one expected So what we do is we do expect that. We expect all these things to happen. And we have created a security paradigm within our plan that can accommodate all those things. And that's why, when I sat down with security experts, whether it was Amos Yadlin or Amir Eshel or Benny Gantz, not just with Netanyahu, they all said this is the plan for the security establishment of the state of Israel. So no one ever did that before. Our predecessors came up with gadgets and gimmicks and sensors along the Jordan River and things that were supposed to make Israel feel comfortable, and they didn't. So I think that's the most important thing. Now, in terms of the point about governance, how would the Israelis and the Palestinians govern each other, whether in two states or is there a way to skin the cat some other way? There are lots of other ways that the mind can wander and come up with, but I do agree that you cannot have two classes of citizens in a country. You cannot do that. It's immoral. But and that's why we called our plan a realistic two-state solution, with emphasis on the word realistic.
Were you mentioned earlier Palestinian rejection? Were you disappointed that there were some Israelis who took issue with aspects of the plan?
Well, look, I mean, I couldn't imagine people wouldn't take issues with aspects of the plan. It's an incredibly controversial subject, and it was an 80, 90-page document. I mean, it was going to get significant commentary, which was good. What was unfortunate was that we went by the time our plan was done, the Israeli political season was really getting into high gear, and it never ended. It still hasn't ended, and so. Instead of having kind of serious, sober conversations about some of these issues with all the protagonists, and many of them had legitimate points, there was a lot of grandstanding, a lot of politicization, a lot of demagoguing, and that made it much more difficult. One thing which was interesting about the plan, it comes to mind, Yuval Steinitz, who's a high-ranking member of the Likud, after all the reactions came out, he came over to me and said, the left thinks you've killed the Palestinian state, and the right thinks that you've created a Palestinian state. So you must have done something right here to get, that kind of reaction from both sides. And that's really the reality. I mean, people care deeply about this, and they should, and they're entitled to. And I hope the conversation continues, not between me and anybody, but between the players, the stakeholders, the Israelis. The Israelis, I think, really need to decide where to land this plane. I think we've given them a good template, and we would support something along those lines, but this is Israel's decision. Yeah.
Let's move on to the unqualified success.
Sure.
The plan in some ways was traded for the Abraham Accords. Mm-hmm. It was taken off the table so that the Emiratis and the Bahrainis, presumably with a Saudi nod, could break the ice with Israel. In my more cynical moments, I wonder whether the plan wasn't conceived, at least at some levels and by some persons, as a kind of throwaway for precisely this purpose. So maybe you could straighten out the chronology for me. I saw a senior U.S. official who was quoted as saying, that we had been talking to both sides, Israel and the UAE, for 18 months. he said the annexation issue or the sovereignty issue created the atmosphere which was conducive for getting a deal. So that means that those talks would have been taking place even as the deal was being formulated and proposed. So were you juggling at the same time these two options even before you released the vision?
Well, of course we were, because, and the proof of it is the day we announced our plan, you had a detailed response from the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, a detailed response from the Kingdom of Morocco. At the ceremony where we rolled out the plan on January 28th, 2020, you had the ambassador of the UAE to the United States, the ambassador of Oman to the United States, the ambassador of Bahrain to the United States. They all stood up. President called them out. They got a rousing standing ovation. So anybody who's paying attention knows that this was more than a series of bilateral discussions between us and Israel. The bilateral discussions were incredibly important, and it was very important to us that we get Israel buy-in, not just from the prime minister, from Gantz as well, so that it had the broadest level of acceptance within the Israeli side. We also knew it was going to be incredibly controversial, and so I think, look, the way I saw it, this piqued the interest of the Arab world. When the Palestinians ran to the UN and failed, I think that a lot of our allies in the Gulf said, you know what, the Palestinians really have lost their veto. This may be the opportunity to move closer to Israel. And we saw that coming. We knew that was in the works. And we were trying, independent of the peace plan, to move the Gulf closer to Israel, because we thought it was just such a natural series of alliances. The question was, you know, what would bring it over the top? Now, from my perspective, I saw two outcomes coming out of this. Outcome number one was that we'd have a historic recognition by the United States of Israeli sovereignty over some portion of Judea and Samaria, which I thought would give life, would begin to move the plan down the playing field. And I thought that would be an important move. I also thought that because of the controversy it was generating, it might, if you will, smoke out the best possible offers that might be available from those who saw in suspending that the cover that they needed to normalize with Israel. So we were, in a sense, triangulating towards an outcome, either one of which would have been acceptable. By the way, acceptable to me or acceptable to Jared. Jared and I were really the ones who were kind of, you know, moving this in a direction. Obviously, my primary contact is with Israel. Jared has enormous contacts and credibility in the Gulf. So we're moving down this path. And then, you know, back in June or so, there was that, you know, famous letter from Youssef al-Ataiba, you know, the Emirati ambassador, writes a letter in Yediot Achronot saying, you know, guys, you know, this annexation really is going to set us back, and maybe there's another path. And of course, that, you know, that was a public statement. We knew that that was their view beforehand. And so the question was, from, you know, from my perspective, you know, well, what option does Israel have in lieu of sovereignty, and how far will they go? And then we had, you know, a series of back and forth, and you know, my feeling was, if we could get full normalization, you know, not tourism, not overflights, not trade offices, but, you know, really the full Monty, you know, embassies, ambassadors, the full range of cooperation that you expect between two countries that are friendly and at peace. I thought, you know, given where the Israeli public was at the time, which was, you know, suffering from the COVID pandemic, the polls showed that there was not a huge interest at that point among the Israeli public in sovereignty. It was not high on their agenda, you know, understandably so, given the ravages of COVID. If we can suspend sovereignty, not cancel it, I don't think cancellation would do justice to the importance of the issue. You can suspend it for a while, give peace a chance, and move forward. That was good with me, and I thought, you know, for the president, for the interest of the United States, to be able to make a once-in-a-generation peace deal with an Arab nation, notwithstanding that the Palestinian issue had not been resolved, I thought that would be a massive game changer. So, you know, as we saw that triangulation moving towards that peace, we started moving closer and closer to it, and I started sharing it more and more, the opportunity with the prime minister. I think there was a consensus that this was, I hate to use the phrase, but it was kind of a no-brainer. This is what we ought to be doing. And we didn't know then that we'd get 4 more countries, but even the UAE alone, we thought was such a significant move in the right direction.
I suppose your task in this triangulation was also to reassure or stroke those Israelis who had been very enthusiastic about the plan as well. And I want to quote one journalist who made the counter argument and ask you how you would respond to it. This was an Israeli journalist who wrote the following: Israel needs to start weighing the advantages and disadvantages of normalizing relations with Arab states. What benefit does Israel gain from open ties? Tourism? Is that an Israeli interest? Does Israel want Persian Gulf tourists streaming into Jerusalem? Is it a burning Israeli interest to forge cultural ties with regimes that treat women like chattel? From Israel's perspective, there are many downsides to maintaining formal, normal relations with regimes that do not share its values. End of quote. So I'll tell you in a moment who that was, but why is it wrong to look at it like that? Make the case for the transformative potential of the Abraham Accords.
I think it's kind of straightforward. The Abraham Accords makes Israel more prosperous, more secure, less exposed to the dangers within the Middle East. I don't know what's wrong with peace, prosperity, and security. There are lots of countries that don't share American values. We try to encourage them to come closer to us. We don't cut them off because of that. We have national strategic interests that we have to vindicate, and that's true of Israel as well. Look, the Emirates are just across the Straits of Hormuz from Iran. To have an ally of the quality of the Emirates, probably the best military apparatus in the Arab world, to have them aligned, at peace with Israel, is enormously important. The second thing, again, the signals to the region. I mean, this is a very important signal, I think, to Israel, from Israel to the Palestinians, to Hamas, to Hezbollah. Israel's not going away. Israel is a permanent member of the Middle East community of nations. Get on board. There's huge opportunity that's going to be available within the Arab world from Israel, and Israel from the Arab world. Get on board. Don't take these ancient grievances and die by them. Take the future and live with it. And everything I've seen since tells me that these were game changers. And again, you add Bahrain, you add Sudan, you add Morocco. Let's just take Sudan as an easy example. That was a corridor for massive, inflow of terrorists and their weapons into Hamas, into Egypt, into Sinai. They're, that's ended. I mean, I hope it's ended. I think it's ended. What's the value of that? I think it's enormous. Yeah,
I think it's a very articulate and persuasive answer. And so I won't mention the author of that quote because you made such a strong case. Mm-hmm. I want to end by looking ahead. Mm-hmm. So you're now a member of the Club of Former Ambassadors.
Yep. If they'll have me, I'm not sure. Yeah.
You'll become a pundit unless you're going back to your law practice, and I take it that's not going to happen. No. So let's do this. Tell me first what the Biden administration should do in this corner of the world over the next 4 years, and then second, tell me what you predict it will do.
Well, the saying about prophecy after the days of Ezra and Nehemiah, right? So I don't have prophecies in the hands of children, and I am long since a child. But look, I think to me, I always view one word as being critical in the Middle East. It's strength. The strong prosper, the strong make peace. The weak, unfortunately, find themselves at great peril. So our policy for 4 years was very much to project American strength within the region and to support the exercise of strength by our allies. In the last 4 years, I mean, we had some terrible terrorist attacks. We had a couple of significant incursions, from Hamas. One kind of pop gun out of Lebanon. But pretty quiet 4 years. Thank God. Why? I think I know why. I think it's because the message that we sent clearly to the region was that if Israel's attacked by its enemies, there will be no restrictions whatsoever on Israel defending itself. We're not going to impose any, hypothetical notions of proportionate force. We're going to tell the Israelis, do what you think is right. And if your view is that you need to end this war as quickly and decisively as possible, you have our support. That message, I think, is what kept a significant level of peace in the region for the past 4 years. Now, if we move back on that and look, Biden just started. I'm not looking to pile on. The campaign is over. He's the president. I'm not looking to pile on, and I'm certainly wishing him well. But this past week, when the Iranians were attacking Americans in Iraq, so we fired back into Syria at an Iranian installation, and our government was quick to make the point that this was a measured and proportionate response to avoid escalation. Now, here's how I interpret that, and here's how I think most people in the Middle East interpret that. That when it comes to Iran, the United States, with a $750 billion military budget, is going to shrink its influence to the exact same size as Iran, which has about a $30 or $40 billion military budget. So we're taking over $700 billion of our budget, and we're moving it off to the side and making it inapplicable to our fight with Iran. What a terrible message that is. The Iranians they just laugh at that. And we have to be, unfortunately in this part of the world, we have to be, far more strategic and far more active and much stronger. It's all about strength. Strength keeps people safe and at peace here. And I think that's my concern about a Biden administration. I hope I'm wrong. I think they're smart enough to know that there was great risk created in the Obama administration that hopefully we've mitigated. But again, what they will do, I don't know. I certainly wish them success, but I'm nervous.
Well, at this point, I'm sure our virtual audience is rising to its feet to give you a standing ovation. I know we're going to see a lot more of you in the media, I hope, pronouncing on the development of the Middle East now that you've become, despite yourself, an expert on the subject. And you'll be in much demand. I want to thank you on behalf of the conference, and on my behalf, this was a stimulating, very interesting.
Well, thank you.
Hour.
It's been an honor for me to be interviewed by someone as accomplished as you, and thank you again for all you've done. And I hope we see each other again soon.
להתראות.
להתראות.